Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Performance Analytics Office Hours. For those of you who are new, welcome. And for those of you who are returning, and I see lots of returning names, welcome back. First, we'll get started with a couple logistics. So office hours, the first thing to remember is that these are for you. We will start with a short presentation on data collection, but this entire hour is for you and helping you. Providing you better guidance, better understanding, and to answer your questions that you have. If you are, actually we're in a new format now that everybody is on mute right now. As we get into the Q&A section, if you'd like to come off mute, we'll turn that on when you ask a question. Previously we'd use text chat, and you should now see a Q&A section in the Zoom window. If you click on that and put your questions in that, as we answer them, we can take you off mute. We may ask you to do that to clarify, but as we get into questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section. We have a few people on who can answer them, so I might answer them, or some of the other experts on the line. If you do want to use the chat, you can, but the Q&A is the preferred method. As we do get into the Q&A after the presentation, we may ask you to, we're going to try and answer your question, but if we do get into detail where we need to really look at your instance, or if there's a problem, we may ask you to open up a case on high, or we'll follow up with you. So just be aware of that. And as we go, this session is being recorded. If you or your organization is not comfortable with that, please disconnect now. But this is being recorded, and it will be posted to the community once we're done. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to switch presentations. And Tom, can you confirm that you're seeing the presentation?
Yes, I see it.
Thanks, Thomas. Welcome. My name is Adam Stout. I'm an outbound product manager for performance analytics and reporting. Today, we're going to talk about the data collection process and how it works, a couple best practices, and just give you a better feeling for what comes in. Some of this is covered in training if you've gone through it before, and some of it is not. So hopefully you'll find this useful and learn something new. Again, once we're done with this session, we'll post the recording as well as this deck into the community for your reference. So what we're going to talk about, and this should take 15 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the data collector architecture, how date processing works in the data collector, then some system properties and job properties that you may adjust to match your use case. All of this is really important, and hopefully we'll add a little, you'll find valuable. All right, so let's talk about the architecture. So the first thing is, where does the data come from? So ServiceNow tables are the same. Whether we're running a report on incident or running PA, the ServiceNow tables are the same in your instance. What happens in performance analytics is the indicator sources define the subset of data we want to see from the tables. Very, very rarely would it be all the data. We're generally going to be looking at new problems, open problems, problems closed today. So the indicator sources define that subset. From there, we have indicators which score, which sum, count, average, whatever the case may be, on top of that data set. So we have ServiceNow tables. So let's say we have incident. On incident, I'll have an indicator source of active incidents, and then my indicator is going to say count the active incidents, sum the total duration that they've been open of the active incidents. We then apply PA breakdowns to those indicators, which are by assignment group, by priority. And this is what we consider the data layer. This is where the data collector lives. Once we have collected data, we then can present that information into a performance analytics widget, which we call the visualization layer. So again, we have the base tables of case. The subset would be opened today, closed today, active P1 incidents. The indicator counts sums, aggregates them in some way, and then the breakdowns provide the by something. And then the visualization shows us that information. A couple of key things to remember about this is that the scores, when we collect them, so we take the active incidents, when we score that data, we store the score in a separate table. So this is the PA scores table. In older instances, it is the PA scores L1 table and L2 table. In most instances now, in all the new instances, and also the PA snapshots table is where we store the snapshot information. Very important note, you should never be querying those tables. They're generally big tables. You always want to be accessing them via the API, and this is the documentation for the API is posted on the doc site, but you never want to query those directly for a few different reasons. If you do need data out of them, you want to access them through the API, which is as optimized as we can make it. The only thing that's collected that's actually stored in those scores tables are automated indicators and the automated breakdowns. Formula indicators are done on the fly. They're calculated on the fly from that data. So the only thing that's in those tables are the scores for the automated indicators. And an important part to just make sure you understand with this too is while the collection, when we do the job collection, it runs in memory. That is the binding factor for us. The critical path for us is memory. So as we talk about some of these things, we do want to understand how is memory impacted on the app node. What happens is we pull all the data back in a very optimized fashion, but we pull the data back from the indicator source, and then we process it in memory and store that data and then write it to the database. So again, everything that we're doing, all the constraints that we have, or any of the constraints we have with performance analytics, they're generally going to be memory bound and understanding how many scores, how many records we have to put into memory before we write them. And so how this works. So we have the job, the collection job. The collection job is what we define to say which indicators we want to collect. The collection job pulls those indicators. It gets the job indicators that are in that job. It looks up those indicator sources and it identifies the sysids of the records that are going to match those indicator sources. Once we have those indicator sources, so let's say all our incidents created today. So we run the query incidents created today. We get those the sysids from that. We then pull those records back page at a time. So it's very optimized, but at the end of the day, we do have to get the scores into memory. We apply the additional conditions and scripts. And a very important note here is that the additional conditions and scripts are run on every row that comes back from the indicator source. So we want to make sure that our indicator source is no larger than it needs to be. We'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means, but the key thing to remember here is that scripts are run on every row that comes back in the indicator source, not just the indicator that it gets back, that it's going to be applied to, not so as we go through. Next, we apply the breakdowns for the indicators, and this is where we carve up the data. We understand that of the new incidents created today, 7 were from this assignment group, 5 were in this assignment group, and we have a total of whatever that total was. And then we collect the scores per period and write it per indicator. So the scores are stored if it's a daily indicator per day, if it was a monthly per month for those indicators. Also, if we are collecting records, we collect the sysids of those records and we put those into the snapshot table. So an important reminder here, when we collect records, we are not saving the entire snapshot of the record. We are collecting the sysids of those records, which we'll then use when we view the current information for those records. All right, so let's get it. Now we have an overview of the architecture of how things work and where indicator sources and indicators and scripts run. Let's talk about date processing. This is one of the most fundamental things that you need to understand with the data collector. What we see what we do in the indicator sources, which you'll see in all the out of the box, is a date condition. Every indicator source has a date condition, and this is different than many other BI solutions. We don't look at the full set of data. We only look at the data that we need to. So what you'll see is this design pattern in virtually every indicator source for open changes, open incidents, open problems, open projects. we're going to see opened at or before today and closed after today or closed as empty. For something today, this would be the same as active equals true, right? State equals open. You actually should get the exact same results. But by using this design pattern, instead of relying on the state, we can then grab this data back in time. Using this, I can look at how many incidents or how many changes are open today, but I can also go back and say, well, what were the changes that were open last month, 10 months ago? Because the open date and the close date don't change. It's either is closed or it's not closed. It was open on a certain date. So for example, for today is replaced by real date. So if I'm collecting this morning, or collecting this for the 4th, which I actually won't run until tomorrow morning, I would see opened at before December 5th and closed after December 5th or December or resolved at as null. And I do want you to note this is absolutely correct for me, I think, in Pacific time zone. You'll notice that collecting for December 4th is not December 4th at midnight. It's December 5th at 6:59:59, which is midnight for Pacific time. When you look at any query in PA, you're going to see that data in what's stored in the database, which is UTC time, right? It will be adjusted for your time zone. Sorry. And the most important thing on here, as I was alluding to, is dates, not states. We do not want to filter on active equals true or state equals open or state equals pending. That is the last resort. If you have to do it, you do it. But generally, what we want to do is build things off of the states or off of the dates. And now let's talk about how this works. So when we're in the indicator source, you're generally going to see today, at or before today, not yesterday, for today. Why this works is in my job, I specify what is today, and we time shift. The data collector time shifts. So if I'm looking at this job, which this is a little small, but what this is saying is a relative start of 3 days ago to a relative end of 1. Generally, this is going to be 1-to-1, but in this example, we're going 3-to-1. What this is going to do in the data collector is we're going to finish the previous indicator source. Data collectors are processed indicator source by indicator source. So I finish my previous indicator source, or I start the job. I query for yesterday's data, which is 1 day ago. I then process the indicators. Then I loop through again and query the database for 2 days ago. And then I process the indicators. And then I go back, I query the data for 3 days ago, and then I process the indicators, and then I move on to the next indicator source, or my job is complete if there's none. So when you're putting this in, that's what happens. It is doing not all the data at one time and slicing it up, but we physically run the query multiple times, right? And then process. A very important note of this is, again, your relative start on a daily job is typically going to be 1-to-1. But if we're doing a historical job, if we're pulling back 3 days, I am quite literally scaling this out that this job will take 3 times longer than if I did 1-and-1. I have to run the same queries, the same processing 3 times instead of 1 time. Really important to understand, if you are collecting multiple dates, is the data going to change? Because if I was doing something like the number of new incidents for yesterday will never change again, right? Yesterday is past. So we want to make sure that we're not collecting the data over and over again. This is one of the great optimizations of performance analytics. Once data is frozen, we freeze it. We don't need to recalculate the same thing over and over and over again if we get the same results. Big difference between reporting and PA, right? And many other systems in PA. We save those scores because they will not change, and we rely on them not changing. And we don't have to look at all data all the time to understand open and incident counts. We can just do day at a time and save that number and then sum those together. Okay, so we have time shifting. Everything that we're going to have, this is a little bit more example is what we talked about, is everything should have a date condition. Indicator sources should have a date condition. They should always have a date condition. So the 2 main examples we're going to see are opened on, closed on an on date condition, and it's generally going to be on today. If you were doing a monthly indicator, this of course could be on this month. but we're going to do on today. Active is the most common thing, or not the most common, is the other common thing we have. And I'm going to see an at or before today, and resolved is empty, or it's after today. For something for today, resolved is going to be empty. But again, the doing the resolved is empty or at or before today makes this historically safe to collect. So all of your indicator sources should have one of those things. It should have one of those things. The only minor exception might be is if you have an indicator source that writes itself out every day, the table that clears itself out every day, and it's a small set of small table. You might not have it, but even then, I probably would put it in anyway. So one of the biggest mistakes I have when you have long-running jobs, it's that you don't have a date condition on there. So we always want to have a date condition on there. As I said before, I have a slide for it because it is so important. When you have a daily data collector, it should be one-to-one, relative 1 day ago to 1 day ago. You can't, and the reason for this is I can't get a count for the number of incidents created today right now. It's too early. I have to wait for the day to finish. So that's why we're doing 1 day ago, so the numbers finish. I see some people adjust this to 0. There is a use case for 0. Don't worry about it. You're going to see 1 and 1. If you have some other use cases where that's not working, we can talk about that later. Again, we want to save time by not calculating things that don't change by redoing the same query over and over again. You have to have a date filter. This isn't going to work right unless you have that date filter that does do it. I never want to see a query. I never want to see an indicator source that has all incidents. The use case for that, we always want to bind it by time. And again, it's a linear scale. Every day, every period I do, it's another query. It's a whole nother round trip through the processing. So that's okay, but be aware of it. And we should not be seeing historical jobs running for a wide time frame, 90 days, 6 months, on a scheduled basis. We certainly will do a historical job. You'll see out of the box content shipping a historical job to pull 90 days of data, maybe 6 months of data. But I don't want to see that running all the time. If that's the case, then there's some use cases for some of that for restating, but you're going to kill your performance if you are collecting 6 months of data for the number of open incidents every day. We don't want to see that. And generally what we're going to see is that your daily jobs, weekly, monthly jobs can have a little bit more flexibility, particularly if you're running on the weekends, but your daily jobs, what I expect to see for your daily jobs is being run between midnight, after midnight, right? It needs to be midnight or 12:01, not 11:59, but midnight, and 6 a.m., 7 a.m., before people get into office. Now, if you're a 24-hour shop, ServiceNow is 24-hour shop. Yeah, well, we still run them between midnight and 6 a.m. for the time zone that they're for. So generally, for ServiceNow, we're based in California. It's going to be midnight, 6 a.m. Pacific time. If I were in the East Coast, if I were in New York, it would be midnight to 6 a.m. Eastern time. You want to run it where the job is. If I am running a job in a different time zone, you want it to be midnight to 6 a.m. that time zone. So I sometimes see mistakes where people are scheduling at midnight their time zone, but that's not where the job is going to be run. Where the job is for, where the time zone is for the indicator source. So make sure it again is midnight to 6 a.m. that the time zone for the data you're collecting. The job is always displayed in your time zone, wherever you are, wherever you have your system set to, your profile set to. So wherever I'm in the world, I always see Pacific time. Make sure you're aware of that. And it doesn't need to run midnight Pacific time if that job is supposed to be running for Central European time. And generally, indicators should only be in one active job. Of my historical jobs, I'm typically going to turn off and have them not be active anymore. It's a guideline. There might be a use case where you need to do this. But again, calculating something like the number of open incidents or the number of new incidents shouldn't change. I only need to do it once. So am I just doing extra work and I get the same number? If you do need real-time data, we want to look at the show real-time score option. So we don't have to run the job multiple times a day, but I actually get the real-time information. So be aware that if I see an indicator in multiple active jobs, we certainly would take a look at why are we doing that. And scripts. We talked about this earlier, that scripts are run for every indicator source or every row in the indicator source, regardless if they're going to be used in that indicator. I only want to see scripts for date processing. Any script that does not have score start or score end, those special variables, concerns me. So I see a lot of this for manual lookups. We want to use a database view instead of a script. There's lots of reasons for this, but again, scripts I want to see with score end, which is where we get date processing. Historically safe date processing is what score start and score end do. I see a lot of overuse of scripts, and that slows down your jobs. And so we always want to look and go, is there a better way to do this? And if you don't have score start and score end in there, generally there is a better way to do it. And I do want to talk, we're going to catch up with some questions in just one second. For historical collections, so we do see the historical collections. This is an example where I'm going to go 90 days back up through now. This is the out-of-the-box PA knowledge historical data collection. A very important note up in the top right corner, historical score collection collects on current values only. So it is not safe to collect data that changes. So let's talk about that just a little bit more. But as we do a historical collection, what happens is I look for today, and then I go back and look for yesterday. Then I look for -2 days, -3 days, -6 days, up to -90. So again, I go through that loop 90 times. So if it takes me 1 minute to collect for today, I would expect this job will take 90 minutes. If it takes me an hour to collect, this job is going to take 90 hours. So remember that, right? It is just purely linear for what the single day runs. I don't run historical jobs like this until I've run a single day. And normally I'll do 2 days just to get that good benchmark. That's going to help me plan. Can I run this right now? It's not going to matter. Or should I run this job on the weekend? History is not really going to change, hopefully. So be aware of that. When you do a historical collection, be aware we cannot collect things like last update date because we are looking at the current values. The reassignment count changes every day, so I can't collect on that. State changes inherently. If I look at the state of all my incidents from last year, the state will always be closed. It's not historically safe to collect. Assignment group changes. Things like priority change, but they're probably getting more accurate, so it's probably okay. Particularly for something from 6 months ago. But when you look at the out-of-the-box data collection, you're going to see we exclude certain breakdowns like age. We exclude certain breakdowns like reassignment count or state. There's a reason for that because we are looking at the current values of the historical collection. And to get to this slide to summarize what we're talking about with historical, it's not possible to retrieve the accurate historical collection on open records for conditions that are based on normal life cycle changes, which is what we talked about before, or for breakdowns, which do the same thing. So state, I have a breakdown by state. That's not going to be valuable. I don't want to exclude it. I'd rather have nothing than have it be wrong. But things like what's open, what's not open, a breakdown by category, a breakdown by priority, those are safe to collect because they don't change. Or again, if they do change, it's now more right. So what I had before didn't really matter. But things like pending does matter. It was right at the time. It's just not right anymore. Category really actually wasn't right. It is now more correct. So important to understand the limitations of historical collections and using breakdown exclusions in your historical collections and understanding how they work. So I'm going to, before we get into the properties, I'm going to go through a couple of the questions, make sure I have those answered. Okay. All right, so a couple questions that we'll cover right now, and then some of these other ones we will get to in a couple other slides. Date timestamps and audit history. Every date you see in ServiceNow should be localized to your time zone, every one you see. If you look at the XML, if you look at what's in the database, it's stored as UTC. But the UI, when you're looking at it, it should always be translated to your time. it's normally good. It's normally not a problem. It gets a little weird when you're trying to schedule a job in a time zone that's not your time zone, right? I might end up scheduling. I'm in the Pacific time zone. If I was scheduling a job to run in New York, I would want it to run at 9:02 my time, which would be quite odd. But in Eastern time, it's very close to midnight. It would be a great time to run that. Okay. So in the time shifting, so there's a question about I want to understand the information for last month. That might be a use case you use last month, but it depends. You have two options. So my indicator source might be last month, but then my date is now. So if I was doing a monthly indicator for last month, do I want the score to be attributed to November or to December? I personally would rather have my November number, which I don't publish until December. I think that makes more sense. But if you label it as last month, then your date on my single score, my date on my list view would say December, last month's score, which would be November. Very weird in my mind. So I'm generally still going to do today, and my job is what's going to pick the date up for yesterday. So the same thing happens on a daily collector. It's set the indicator sources today, but I don't have numbers for December 4th. I only have numbers for December 3rd because I don't get those until then. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on through a couple other slides because we're going to answer some questions. I think if I answer your question, you can clear it out. And if not, we will go through when we get done with a couple more slides. Okay, so we're going to talk about some system properties that are important to understand. There's 7 collection properties. If you go to Performance Analytics System Properties, there are also reporting properties and dashboard properties. We are talking about data collector properties, so Performance Analytics. Those are listed. You should be able to see what they are. I'm going to talk about 4 important ones, which are labeled here. You'll have this slide as a reference, so we're going to go through them a little bit quickly. The maximum number of rows allowed to fetch an indicator source. So this one trips people up. The default is 50,000. 50,000 is very safe. You will not have a problem. This number needs to be, this is the number of records that an indicator source can return. If you go over that number, we will not return any data. So if I have, the default is 50,000. If I have 50,001 active incidents, this will go, it's too high. You need to set this to the number of open records that you're looking at. So if I'm looking at incidents and I have 100,000 open incidents, this needs to be 120,000. It needs to be over your number of open incidents. The reason we set it this way is because I do not want to see a million. I don't want to see this. I don't want to have a million incidents come back if I only have 100,000 active incidents. This is a safeguard from somebody not putting a date condition in. It's global. These are all system level global settings, but this does need to be set to what your highest number is. So if 50,000 is it, awesome. But if you need to set it to 75, 100,000, 200,000, then that's what you need to set it to. It is purely, it's more of a logical guard than anything else. There is an impact on memory because if I pull back a million records and I have lots of permutations, it can have an effect on that. Next one's important is the number of records stored per indicator. Default for this is 5,000. This is snapshots. If I'm collecting records, what this is saying is for every bucket, for every permutation. So it's actually not per indicator, but per indicator element and second level elements as well. How many records will we keep in the snapshot? This is 5,000 for a reason, because it's actually stored in 5,000, up to 5,000 sysids for, let's say, open incidents. But it's 5,000 for open incidents, 5,000 for P1s, 5,000 P2s, 5,000 P3s, P4s, every assignment group, right? So for the database assignment group, and up to 5,000 for the database assignment group and priority and P1s, right? So database P1s, database P2s, network P1s. That adds up to a lot of records that we have to store. And generally what we see is 5,000 is too many for a human to look at. So it's a good safeguard because if you're not going to scroll through 100,000 users or 100,000 records, 100,000 incidents. So let's just keep it at 5,000. You want to keep this down. If you increase it up a little bit, it's okay. But if you set this to 50,000, it's going to have a big impact on your memory usage. We're going to have problems with your jobs. And then storage is going to balloon quite a bit as well. So 5,000 is a really good number for this. Because again, at the end of the day, it's how many you're going to scroll through, how many pages you're going to do at 20 incidents at a time, or even 50 incidents at a time. You're not going to scroll through 5,000 records, let alone 50,000. Maximum number of breakdown elements in a breakdown defaults to 10,000. So if I have 10,000 assignment groups, good luck. Where we normally see this, if somebody's trying to break down by CI, you don't want to do that. It's going to impact memory again. And then dashboard load performance, because we do have to load these in. The more elements you have in a breakdown, the slower your load performance is. If you need to raise it from 10,000 to 12,000 to 15,000, okay, but this should not be 100,000. You're going to see a lot of performance issues. We should have a different talk about how we can better optimize what we need to do. If you need to raise it up a little bit, it's okay, but generally 10,000 is a good number. I actually try to keep my breakdown sources under 1,000 elements. I get concerned over 1,000, so 10,000 is higher than I would normally set this. And then the last one that's in here is the maximum number of elements produced by combining two breakdowns. This is every permutation times every permutation. So my P1s by assignment group, under 1 million. You're not actually going to get all million, but this is just the million is the theoretical possibility, because that's a lot of scores. It's going to have an impact on memory and storage if you actually hit it. I don't see this happening very much, and if I do, it's because I'm doing something like caller and assign to, which has no value anyway. So I'll add a breakdown exclusion to stop that from happening. If you hit this, you probably should fix it, not just raise this. So again, out of the big ones, I do raise the number of max rows. The other ones I don't touch. And ideally, I would lower the number of breakdown elements, because it's going to give me a healthier system. It's going to force some conversations about what am I really trying to do. Okay, I'm just going to check if there's any questions about the properties.
Adam, there is a question: if only one of the scores in the account is more than 50K, the job still errors out?
If you have set if you've raised that limit, it shouldn't. So if you've raised your limit for the max records for this first one, max row count indicator source, if you're getting if you need to retrieve back 100,000 records, set it to 100,000, it should be fine. If it's still erroring out, then there's something else going on, and it depends what the error is. So if you can put in the question what the error message is, we can talk about why we're getting that error message. Otherwise, you're going to want to open up a case to take a look at it. But certainly, we process more than 100,000, 200,000. I see some big numbers. Just be aware of what you're doing. And again, I want you to make sure you understand what this number is, and then you can change it. Don't just change it and not look at everything else. A few more slides. So let's talk about time zones. This was a couple questions that came in. So the time zones, there are 2 time zones involved. The first one is the run as time zone, number 1 up here. So this is run at specific time. Out of the box, I think everything's set to system, which is fine. Again, I'm Pacific. If you were Eastern, if you were Central European, if you're Australian, that's fine. If you don't set it, you're going to be at system. That's okay. It's okay. But if you do need to set it for a specific time zone, set it for that time zone. That is what today will be. So when we looked at that example towards the beginning, we saw that today was actually 7 hours before UTC. That's fine. That's correct for Pacific time, or was when I took the snapshot. Today will be defined by this time zone. So again, if I'm trying to answer this for New York, then I'm going to want to set this to Eastern time zone. Today will be in fact impacted. This month is impacted. All the date functions are then shifted to that time zone. Also, score start and score end. If you don't set it, you're going to get the system time zone. That's the default. And some people, want to have an indicator, which is always my day, my day. How do you run a business? I look at this the same way we closed our financial books. You pick a time zone, right? Wherever you're headquartered, that's the time zone. That's where your quarter ends. You have to have some number. Now, if I have one for EMEA, one for the US, and one for APAC, that's fine. It's fine, right? I could have 3 different indicators. But for this indicator, at some point, we need to cut off what the day is. Second time zone involved is when the job runs. And again, this is my time zone. So I'm in Pacific. This is in Pacific. 4 a.m. is okay. 4:15 is okay. When as somebody in Pacific, whenever I install out of the box content, it almost always runs at 3 p.m. Very weird time. Why does it 3 p.m.? Because that's the offset from UTC. So be aware of that and understand what time zone you're running as and what time zone you're seeing. And particularly if you're remote and you're not where the central, where these jobs run, that time zone, that's your time zone. For best practices, again, we talked about this before. It should be run between midnight and 6 a.m. for the effective time zone, the run as time zone. And generally, we don't want to have jobs overlap. So the memory on the apps or the app nodes is shared in that app node. The load should be distributed across nodes, but if I have my choice, I'm going to run my jobs spread out between midnight and 6 a.m. If you need to run two jobs at the same time, that's okay. You don't want to have all your jobs fire at midnight. You don't want to have all your jobs fire at 12:30. Spread them out. You got a couple hours, spread them out. Hopefully your job should be running in 2 to 5 minutes. That's a nice, healthy job, daily job. Some do take longer for that for some reasons. If we have jobs running longer than half an hour, running than an hour, there's probably something else going on that we can speed that up. Most often, if I have a slow job over half an hour, it's because I have scripted breakdowns, which again, I want to get rid of unless they have data processing. And or they're collecting historically. They're collecting 30 days worth of data every day. So if we tune those things up, we're typically going to get our jobs down to 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 3 minutes. Then it's very easy to spread them out. It is instance specific. It has to do with the data that you're collecting. So how much memory you're going to use based on what the settings we had. And then it has to do with how many nodes you have and what else is going on. But if you can spread them out, it's going to reduce the likelihood of anything going wrong. And the last setting we're going to talk about is the run as user. So generally this ships as system administrator, sysadmin. Now a lot of our customers disable sysadmin. That's a problem, but it's not a bad problem. Very, very solvable. So we ship it as sysadmin because most users have sysadmin unless you deleted it. The big key thing here is that run as needs to be an active user. Needs to be an active user. The data collector itself bypasses ACLs, so it doesn't have to be a privileged user. It does not have to be an admin user. It just needs to be a user. So I generally will create a user called Performance Analytics. Has no roles, nothing. For my normal collections, I'm good. If I do run scripts, the scripts will run as this run as user. So that's important to know, but I don't want to give my user admin. I don't want to have extra admins. So I'm going to have no roles. And then if there's some ACL that it needs to happen that I'm going to access in a script, which again, I don't want to access scripts, but if I am going to run a script, make sure that user has access to execute the script. If they're reading data, that it can read the data, whatever the case may be. An important note of this on the same slide is the collector bypasses the ACLs because we're just getting counts and sysids. If we're displaying records, if you have collect records displayed, the ACL of the user viewing the scorecard, viewing the workbench, has to have access to view the records. So the ACLs, when you're viewing it, happen, but since I don't know who's going to view it, we have to interpret them then. The data collector itself can get the data. And if you do have any scripting going on, debugging is a lot simpler if it's not admin, because there's a lot of stuff in the logs about admin. I don't run it as yourself because you can't tell the difference in the log between you and the user. But if I have performance analytics, if I am debugging a script or any issue, what's running, it's really easy to go performance analytics is the user running performance analytics. I might even break them up, create a couple users, one for PA, HR PA, one for ITSM PA, one for CSM PA. That's fine too. Different people like to do different things on how they run that, but I generally change it. I change it from sysadmin to a dedicated user. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up, and I see that I talked a little bit too long. Just a couple of key things. Make sure you understand that data flow that we talked about at the beginning in the architecture, what processes when and where. That you need to understand that if you're going to tune the performance. If you miss one of those things, you might be throwing too much in one place and we're shifting the load. So make sure you look at those slides, understand where and when things are processed. Two, the time shifting. make sure you wrap your mind around that. Think about, understand what time shifting means for the data collector. Dates, not states, dates, not states, and dates, not states. And think about what's historically safe to collect and what's not historically safe to collect. And then the settings matter. Those properties do things, right? Don't just go, oh, this is an error, change that property. The defaults are there for a reason. Make sure you understand the ramifications of changing that reason. If you just change them to whatever, whenever, for whatever reason, we're going to have problems down the line for something else. Okay. So you can change them. They are there. They're properties. We don't hard code these things, but do understand what your use case is and why we want to change them. Why do we want to set the time zone? Why do we need to set the max records? All right. And now we're into our questions. So we have quite a few questions. So I had audit history. We talked about the circle date. So I'm going through the Q&A. If you have anything else to ask, we're going to go through the Q&A window. So please submit it in there. So there is a question. We utilize the admin we utilize the admin console to look at the data collection overview to get the idea of how long our jobs run. If they're running too long, is there a way to see the strain on the system? So what it's doing is a good question. It depends on where the long-running job is. Generally, what you're going to see is the long-running job is in MapReduce. If you look at the log as far as what it's doing, if you're in MapReduce, we're processing the indicator source. If you have, if you're returning millions of records in your indicator source, that does just take a little bit of time. We're iterating through the records. If you're at 100,000 records, that should be very quick. I'm generally going to see it's a script that your script is executing. We have to instantiate a scripting environment, a sandboxed environment, execute the script, get the results back one at a time. I don't like scripts. I write them. I used to write them a lot. They're bad for performance. There's better ways of doing it. So if you have a long running job, it's a script. That's just where we're going to get from. We'll be writing some more about how to reduce your usage of scripts. I see a lot of them to get around about data design. So, we got to look at how can we write that record? How can we write that someplace else? As far as what it's doing, it's actually generally not a big load on the instance, although as it's running, it's keeping it's got to keep everything in memory. So if the job runs for an hour, it's hogging that memory for an hour. If we can reduce that down, everything else gets better. Once you start exhausting your memory, it's kind of a downhill slide very quickly. So the key to performance is get rid of scripts. Make sure you're not pulling back too much data and then get rid of scripts. How do we show real-time scores for all indicators? Don't show real-time scores for all indicators. It is a checkbox on the indicator about if you want to see that live data. But what happens is it has query PA and then it effectively goes and runs the report, right? It's going to go run what you're doing against the live data. That's great for P1s, right? Number of active incidents, unassigned active incidents, something you're going to take action on. And real time really does mean real time, right? If you are sitting at your dashboard, you'll see new incidents come in without any refresh. It is pushing that data to your instance. It's awesome, but I reserve that for things like number of P1s, number of unassigned incidents that I really do need up to the second. Things like the number of incidents opened yesterday, I don't need you to query that. Number of total incidents open today. That's neat. I mean, it's important to have, but it doesn't actually change what I'm doing minute to minute. So be judicious on what you set to real time, because it has to go get that real time data, which is going to slow down your dashboard load time. Hopefully, a very small amount, but millisecond, a second, what's acceptable. Make sure that real time provides you value, and then it is a checkbox that you can add to your list view. So you could do it in bulk if you wanted to. Can you use dates from the audit history? You don't want to query sysaudit. I have seen querying of metrics. It's not something I'd want to. It's not something I would want to do. I generally don't want to query my sysaudit history. For one historical load, I might do it with some jobs, but it's very taxing. If it's something that's really important, then I'd want to look at creating metrics for it, and I would want to look at actually putting those dates in my life cycle on the record. So something like resolve date on an incident. Resolved is so important, I make it a date. Maybe on incident, I would put first assigned, right? Although with some of that, I can get it from the SLAs. So My real key dates, if I've configured my SLAs right, I normally get everything I want from that. If I have my metrics right, I get what I want from that. If I'm querying audit, I have a real question about, is my data model actually reflecting my business? And then again, I also wouldn't want to spend 3 or 4 weeks scripting something up, getting it all together to do a one-time load from audit that it doesn't help me go forward. I can't change the past, right? And particularly if I'm making process change. So a lot of people ask for stuff like this, but then when you actually go to why and what the value is, it's generally pretty low. That being said, there's if I have metrics, there's things that can be done. We discourage it because of it's such a low ROI to pull back data from your audit. Oh, state. Sorry. So I think this is related about the state duration metrics. State durations are all about metrics. So we do a great lab at Knowledge on metrics. I think we've done it in office hours before as well. Having metrics on state and then applying PA is amazing. It is some serious value that comes out about how long is something in pending. Why does this team keep records and incidents in pending, 5 times longer than this other team? What's going on? So incredibly valuable information, but you want to base it off of metrics, not off of sys audit. And Zach, I lost your question about using the score. So if you could put in the full question, or hopefully I answered it. Okay, great question about elements. So breakdown elements. One of the best features I love in breakdown sources. Question comes up of, I want to break down by assigned to. Hopefully I'm summarizing this correctly. I break down by assigned to, and while I have 100,000 users in sysuser, so that's 100,000 elements. That's correct. Well, 100,000 people don't have incidents, right? So a couple things you can do. You can do has role and restrict it to a role, like only users with this role. That's okay. The way that I do it is a related list condition on my breakdown source. So on my breakdown source, I'm only going to look for users with and if you search for related list condition, we have a couple examples out there. If you search for advanced query techniques in the community, you'll find an article on it. Walks through a bunch of use cases for related list conditions and some for scripted filters. But the related list condition will allow me to say, only show me people who have had an incident assigned to them in the last 6 months. It's really key that you're using some index fields and that query returns very quickly, but those are indexed, so it should. But what that allows me to do is, even if you don't have the ITIL role today, but you had an incident last week, I'd still see you. And if you have the downside is if you have ITIL role and you don't have any incidents, I wouldn't see you, but generally I don't care if you're not doing anything. It's a different issue. So using related list conditions on your breakdown sources can help you get a very tuned list in your elements, which is great because I only want to see people that I actually care about. That allows me to do that. And it also improves performance. So you improve performance and usability in your user experience. It's a win-win on both sides of those. But you definitely do want to tune your breakdown sources to only be meaningful. And if that means you do need to use a scripted filter, go ahead and do it. But I've found related list conditions to be just a killer feature there. So there's a question about dedicated user. I believe this has to do with the running the job. You don't need a role generally for the PA. You actually can run PA with no roles whatsoever. You should only assign roles that are needed. So again, the data collection itself doesn't need them. Scripts do. So specifically, if your script is running a glide record or a glide record, it's going to use the ACLs that are needed. You shouldn't use glide records in your scripts because it's going to be a performance issue. But if you're doing it, that script will execute as that user. So to execute the script, you need the role. But the actual data collection doesn't need any roles whatsoever. And what I see most people is over provision it because they see sysadmin, which is the only user we know is going to be there. And it's not always there. So just make sure it's a user. Again, I create one called performance analytics data collect, doesn't matter what it's called, set it to that. run everything as that, and you're going to be in better shape. Don't run it. You don't need to run it as sysadmin, and don't run it as a specific user, because that user leaves and now your jobs start failing. All right, good. I like this one. Random question. The type preview for the score report is 42. Is that an Easter egg? Yes. Performance Analytics, before it was Performance Analytics, was a company called Mirror 42. And you can guess why it was called 42. So old habits die hard. So yes, you'll see some 42s in the Performance Analytics space. So I'm just scanning through and see if we have any more on these. Okay, one I definitely want to answer has to do with database view versus a script in PA performance. The view is better. 100% view is better. View is better, and view is better. Now the view, you have to create the view, requires admin. What I've seen when we're doing an indicator sorts with 100,000 records, compared to a manual lookup, right, which is a script querying the manual breakdowns table or something else, I see something like a 7 to 8 times improvement in time, right? So something that took 7 minutes before would go down to a minute. It is going to be data specific. There could be some other options, but it's always better. Now, if your script is just doing time shifting, there's no querying. It's very lightweight. It's actually pretty fast, and I can't do it in a view. But what I do not want to see is a script that has a glide record that's just creating an artificial join, when I can do that join in a database view and put my indicator on top of that, my indicator source on top of that. Now, this is a bit of an issue if I've already collected my data, because I have to force that indicator source to change. But you do want to look into that. The database view is many, many times better than using a PA script. So you definitely want to look in that area. And if you're starting something new, do that. So a question about color coding states in a breakdown element. I believe you cannot do that in performance analytics. It works in reporting. I believe that's a known issue that we should be able to honor the same things that are in reporting, but it does not do that today. Wade has a question about scripts for incident age. No, that is the use case for scripts. Because of the time shifting, you need to use the average. You need to use a script. I do expect you to have score start and score end in there. If not, then you just need to update the script. But having the average age, incident, how long has the incident gone without being updated? You need to use a script for it, plain and simple. That's the use case. I don't have anything better. That script is very performant anyway, so you're actually okay. The biggest issue, the reason I say no scripts, has to do with when people are running glide queries, or they're doing weird stuff, or they're doing buckets or something that's not age. If you have score start or score end in your script, I will not yell at you. But if you don't, I will yell at you. There's a question about not seeing data for my first month, and I think with that you might want to post a question in the community with a screenshot, or put a case in high, because there's a few things that could be, but it's hard to tell without actually looking at your configuration of what's going on. The most common thing is that there's a time aggregate, and you're not using the plus, but again, if you could put a screenshot in on the community and ask some questions, there's a lot of people who could probably answer that for you pretty quickly and give you a more definitive issue. Question coming in about Analytics Hub. The Analytics Hub's not configurable in terms of displays right now. Having percentages and absolute counts and percentages is something that is on the list. I know it's in the backlog. I don't know where it's at. Not an unreasonable request at all, but today the Analytics Hub is what the Analytics Hub is. It's very similar to the Workbench. There's no configuration options. In the indicator source, what is the good? Okay, let's talk about this too. Sorry, I'm just checking my. All right, we do need to wrap up in a minute, but hopefully this will be good. Indicator source. What's a good use for report source as opposed to using a fact table? I don't use report sources as my indicator sources. The biggest issue is, and you just need to be aware of it. It can be really good. The two issues are on my indicator source. I'm going to have my dates, the date field, right? That has to do with the created on before today, resolved as empty or after today. That confuses my users in reports when they see that. It just confuses them. And the report source doesn't need it. It won't change anything, but they don't need it. But I need it for my indicator source. So that's a little uncomfortable sometimes. And then the other issue that we run into is that when you update a report source, it does not immediately update the indicator source. You have to go to the indicator source and say refresh the conditions. And that gives me a false sense of security, which I don't like. So I don't use report sources as indicator sources. The biggest use case I've seen for them is that the report source is really confusing. It's really convoluted, or there's lots of things in there. And so I don't want to type it in one place. It's easier just to update it rather than recreate it. However, if I have that, I have other problems, right? I don't want to have complicated stuff. Complicated conditions will never perform well, right? I mean, they don't. And logically, it's really hard too. There's a lot of badness that comes with that. So what I'd rather do is figure out how to make it simple enough that it's easy to recreate and have in two places, right? One with the extra date condition, one without. So I don't use report sources as indicator sources, mainly because of that refresh thing, the user experience I don't like. For me, there's not enough benefit to do it. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay.
So Adam, there is one that was in the chat that is related to data collection, and it was early in it, but it was talking about if you fix an SLA defect or survey defect from last month, should you rerun the historical job to update that?
Right. Okay. Thank you. So if that has to do, if I'm restating history, yeah, that's when you run a historical job. Right. It's wrong. I need to fix it. Yeah, then go ahead and do it. Right. If it's safe to do, right? If I fix my SLAs and I recalculate everything, then you can run a historical collection. It should be something it's an exception, not a rule. I'm always hesitant against, always doing that because you're also going to have to exclude some breakdowns, right? Like on state. So you want to make sure you don't overwrite them with bad data. You want to exclude them. So it's okay. But if you do need to restate them, then absolutely. That's when you would do it. There is an exception that we come through, like my resolve counts, but where I'm going to have a look back, and I don't consider it a big historical collection, but I have a look back of 3 days because the numbers are in flux for 3 days. Similar to how we don't close the books on our financial records at 12:01, the first day of the quarter. It takes a few days to kind of reconcile everything. Sometimes you need to do that with some jobs. Very, 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 very few. Very, very tight specific use cases. But if I am restating history because it was wrong, then yeah, good historical collection use. All right, I think we're going to wrap up because we are at our time, and I see a lot of people have already had to log off. So thanks for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and Thomas is going to be presenting on drill downs in multiple
data sets.
Yeah. Some great stuff having to do with reporting. Between now and then, please use the community, look at the doc site, post questions, read stuff, answer some questions. We're here to help you all the time. And we look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks.